Chapter 13. Her Name is Always Remembered. Fagin was very angry when he heard the story that Noah told him. He was so angry that his whole body shook. He sent for Sykes and told him. Sykes was just as angry as Fagin. He was especially angry when Noah told him that Nancy had put something in his drink to make him sleep. He tried to rush out of Fagin's house, but the door was locked. Fagin would not unlock it. "Listen to me first," he said. "Do what you have to do, but be smart, Bill. Don't be too rough. Try to keep safe." He unlocked the door and Sykes rushed out. He went straight to his room. Nancy was asleep. He woke her up and pulled her out of the bed. He told her that he knew about her visit to London Bridge. She cried. She begged him not to hurt her. He took his gun out of his pocket. He did not shoot her because he knew that people would hear the shot. He hit her face with the gun. She fell. Her face was bleeding. She used Rose Maylie's handkerchief to try and stop the blood. Sykes got a heavy piece of wood and struck her with it. Nancy moaned. He struck her again and again until she lay dead on the floor. He put a cloth over her body. There was a lot of blood. Even the dog had blood on its feet. He washed them. He burned the piece of wood in the fire. He took the dog and left the room, locking the door behind him. He didn't know what to do. He went this way and that way. Sometimes he ran. At other times, he walked very slowly. Then he ran again. He went around in circles. All the time he thought he could see Nancy's dead body and her eyes following him. Finally, at the end of a long day, he went to a village called Hatfield. There he went into a hotel, where he ate and drank and almost fell asleep in a chair. A man at the hotel noticed a stain on Sykes' hat. It was Nancy's blood. Sykes rushed out and ran down the street. He came to a post office and heard people talk about the terrible murder of a woman in London. He left Hatfield. He found a shed and tried to sleep there. The wind moaned through the trees. It sounded just like Nancy's moan when she died. He could not sleep. Then he heard men shouting. He rushed out of the shed. There was a fire, and men were trying to put it out. Sykes helped them. He worked harder than any of them. When the fire was out, he sat with the men and had breakfast with them. They began to talk about the murder. He hurried away again. He still didn't know what to do. He decided to go back to London. "I'll get some money from Fagin and go to France," he thought. He walked back toward the city. He realized that people might recognize his dog. He decided to kill it, but the dog ran away. Mr. Brownlow went to the hotel that Nancy told him about. He found Monks there and spoke to him. Monks was angry, but he was also afraid, so he agreed to talk in Mr. Brownlow's house. Mr. Brownlow and Monks knew each other. Mr. Brownlow was the best friend of Monks' father, and was going to marry his friend's sister, but she got sick and died. Monks' father and mother did not like each other and did not live together. Monks lived with his mother, who taught him to hate his father. His father became friends with a man who had 2 daughters. One of these daughters was 19 years old. Her name was Agnes. The other daughter was only 3 years old. Agnes fell in love with Monk's father. Then a rich member of his family died and left Monk's father a lot of money. Very soon after that, Monk's father died, and all the money went to Monk's mother. "However," said Mr. Brownlow, "before your father died, he had told me his plan. He was going to give his wife some money and take the rest of the money and go to another country. He planned to take Agnes with him. He gave me a beautiful picture of her. When your father died, I tried to find his friend, but they were gone. When I first met Oliver, I saw that he looked exactly like the picture. Monk's mother died, and Monks went to live in the West Indies. Mr. Brownlow went there to look for him, but discovered that Monks was back in England. Mr. Brownlow returned to England and continued his search. Your father wrote a will," continued Mr. Brownlow, "but your mother burned it. The will said that if Agnes had a baby, he or she should receive most of the money. You tried to destroy all the evidence that Oliver was that child. However, your mother kept some letters that Agnes wrote to your father." Monks had to agree that all this was true. That afternoon, the police took Fagin to jail. They came to his house. Toby was there with Charlie Bates, but they escaped. Noah was there too, and he tried to hide in an empty barrel, but the police saw his long legs sticking out of the top. They took him to jail too. Toby went to a secret hiding place in an old building on a muddy island in the river. It was the dirtiest part of London. There he met some other friends. They talked about Fagin. They knew that he would hang. As they were thinking about this in silence, a white dog jumped in the window. It was Sykes's dog. It could not find anybody at the other hiding places, so it came to this one. Toby and his friends could not understand why the dog was alone. Where was Sykes? They gave the dog something to drink, and it went to sleep in a corner of the room. Some time later, somebody knocked on the door. At first, they thought it was Charlie Bates, but it was Sykes. He came in. He was shaking. He sat down. They all looked at each other. They heard another knock on the door. This time it was Charlie Bates. He came in and was surprised to see Sykes. He was very angry with Sykes and began to shout, and then he hit him. Sykes tried to stop him, but Charlie Bates shouted louder and louder. Sykes put him in a different room and locked the door, but Charlie kept on shouting. "Help, murderer! He's here!" he shouted from the window. Soon they could hear people coming across the old wooden bridge to the house. They heard another knock on the door. Then the people started to break the door. Sykes looked out of the window and saw that there were a lot of people outside. He got a long rope and went up onto the roof of the building. His plan was to lower himself to the river, where there was only mud, as the tide was out. The people saw him on the roof and shouted. Then the door broke, and all the people rushed to the other side of the house. Sykes put the rope around himself to go down to the mud. He fell. The rope slipped to his neck. It was not long enough to reach the ground, and Sykes died. His dog was on the roof with him. It jumped down onto Sykes's shoulders, but then fell onto the ground and broke its neck. 2 days after this, Oliver was in a carriage with Mrs. Maylie and Rose, Mrs. Bedwin, and the good doctor, Mr. Losberne. Mr. Brownlow was in another carriage behind them. They were going toward the workhouse where Oliver was born. Oliver saw the house where Dick lived and said he wanted to make Dick happy. Rose agreed. They went past Mr. Sowerberry's shop and the workhouse. They came to a hotel and went in. Mr. Grimwig was there. Dinner was ready for them. After dinner, the gentlemen had a meeting. Finally, they came into the room where Oliver and Rose were. They brought Monks with them. Oliver was surprised and afraid when he recognized him. Mr. Brownlow told Oliver that Monks was his half-brother. Their father was Edwin Leafward, who was Mr. Brownlow's good friend. Oliver's mother was Agnes Fleming, the beautiful daughter of Edwin's friend. Agnes's father passed away soon after Agnes died. Somebody in the village looked after Agnes's sister. A lady saw her and liked her. She took her home and brought her up. That lady was Miss Maylie, and Agnes's sister was none other than Rose. This meant that Rose was in fact Oliver's aunt. A few hours later, Harry Maylie arrived. He told Rose that he had decided to become an ordinary person and work in the church. This meant that Rose could marry him, and she agreed to be his wife. The only sad news that day was that Dick had died. Fagin sat in a cell waiting to be hanged. It was dark and cold in the jail, but he did not seem to care. He thought about all the other people who had sat in this cell waiting to be hanged. He thought about his boys. Some of them had sat here too. It was the night before the hanging. Mr. Brownlow and Oliver came to visit him. They wanted to know about the letters that Monks had given him. Oliver was very frightened, but he was brave. Fagin whispered to him and told him where the letters were. Mr. Brownlow and Oliver left. The next day, Fagin was hanged. 3 months later, Harry and Rose were married. Mrs. Maylie went to live with them. Giles and Brittles lived there, too. Oliver agreed to let Monks have half the money left by their father. Monks went to live in America, where he soon wasted his money and died in jail. Mr. Brownlow made Oliver his son and went to live near Harry and Rose. Mr. Losberne stayed back in Chertsey for a while, but at last he came to live there too. He became friendly with Mr. Grimwig, and they often met up and talked. The police let Noah go free because he told them more about Fagin. Mr. and Mrs. Bumble lost their jobs at the workhouse, and finally ended up living in the workhouse because they became poor. Charlie Bates decided that being a criminal was a bad idea. He left London and found work on farms. In the church where Harry Maylie worked, there is still a sign with the name Agnes on it. There is no coffin there, but her name is always remembered.